Picture this. You're kneeling in the courtyard of Edo Castle in 1651, forced to watch as your fellow samurai, once proud and honourable, is slowly being prepared for a punishment so meticulously cruel that even hardened warriors are averting their eyes. His crime? A perceived slight against his daimyo that wouldn't merit a reprimand in any other culture. But here, in feudal Japan, where honour is currency and shame is worse than death, he's about to experience tsurushi, suspension torture that will keep him hovering between life and death for days. The ropes are already cutting into his flesh, positioned with mathematical precision to maximise pain while preventing the mercy of unconsciousness. His wife and children kneel nearby, forced to witness every moment, because in feudal Japan, punishment wasn't just about the criminal. It was about destroying entire bloodlines through orchestrated suffering that would echo through generations. Before we descend into this meticulously documented world of refined cruelty, where torture became an art form and execution a spiritual ceremony, if you're fascinated by how concepts of honour and justice can be twisted into engines of unimaginable suffering, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that exposes the darkest chapters of human history. And please share in the comments where you're watching from. It's profound to think we're exploring these brutal practices together from around the world, perhaps even from places where these very punishments were once carried out with terrifying regularity. What you're about to discover isn't the romanticised samurai culture of movies and novels. This is the documented reality of a society that elevated punishment to levels of sophistication that make medieval European torture look crude by comparison. The Japanese didn't just execute criminals, they transformed punishment into elaborate rituals where every cut, every position, every moment of agony had spiritual and social significance. In feudal Japan, how you died mattered more than why you died, and the state had perfected thousands of ways to ensure your death served as both punishment and performance. Let's begin with a fundamental truth about feudal Japanese society that explains the extreme nature of their punishments. This was a culture built on rigid hierarchy, where your position determined not just your life, but your death. A samurai who stole would face different punishment than a merchant who committed the same crime, not because the crime differed, but because their social positions demanded different forms of suffering. The punishment system wasn't about justice in any modern sense. It was about maintaining cosmic order through precisely calibrated pain. The concept of ichizoku, collective responsibility, meant that punishment extended far beyond the individual criminal. When a person committed a serious crime, their entire family line could be extinguished. Men would be executed, women sold into slavery, children killed or castrated to prevent future generations. But the Japanese refined this concept beyond simple murder. They developed methods to ensure that every family member experienced distinct, appropriate suffering based on their age, gender, and relationship to the criminal. A criminal's mother might be forced to execute her own son, his wife made to prepare his body for torture, his children branded and exiled to live as outcasts. The Japanese approach to torture tools reveals a mindset that viewed human suffering as a technical problem to be solved with innovation. They created devices that would seem impossibly complex for their singular purpose of creating pain. The spider lily, metal claws that slowly pulled flesh from bones in petal-like strips. The hollow horse, a triangular wooden device victims were forced to straddle with weights attached to their ankles, splitting them slowly over days. Each device had a poetic name that belied its horrific purpose, as if giving torture artistic names somehow elevated it beyond mere cruelty. Consider the punishment called kamayude, boiling in iron cauldrons. But the Japanese didn't simply throw victims into boiling water. The process was ritualized down to the smallest detail. The water was heated slowly while the victim stood bound beside it, watching the temperature rise. Specific herbs were added at precise moments, not for mercy, but to ensure the victim remained conscious longer. The executioner used a specialized pole to prevent the victim from losing consciousness by drowning. Family members were arranged in order of closeness to watch, with specific positions designated for parents, siblings, spouses, and children. The entire process could take hours, with the victim kept at the edge of death, but never allowed to cross over until the ritual was complete. The practice of nokogiri biki, death by sawing, showcased Japanese innovation in prolonging agony. Unlike European sawing executions that were relatively quick, the Japanese used specialized saws with teeth designed to maximize pain while minimizing actual cutting speed. The victim would be buried up to their waist or neck, and passers-by were invited to take turns with the saw, each making 1 or 2 cuts. The social participation transformed execution into a community event, where refusing to participate could mark you as sympathizing with criminals. Some victims survived for days as dozens of people took their turns, the saw moving imperceptibly through neck or waist. The role of professional torturers in feudal Japan occupied a unique social position. These weren't brutish thugs, but highly trained specialists who studied anatomy, psychology, and even poetry. They underwent years of apprenticeship, learning precisely how much pain the human body could endure without dying, which pressure points would cause maximum suffering, how to read a victim's physical responses to prevent premature death. These men developed their own schools of torture technique, passing down secret methods through generations. Some became so renowned that daimyos would loan them to each other for particularly important executions. The water torture methods developed in feudal Japan surpassed simple drowning in their psychological sophistication. Mizuzame involved suspending victims upside down and slowly dripping water onto their forehead. Not enough to drown, but the constant droplets over days would drive victims insane before killing them. But the Japanese added layers of cruelty. The water would be collected from specific sources: tears of the victim's family, water from sacred sites they'd defiled, or melted snow from mountain peaks representing purity they'd corrupted. Executioners documented that victims would begin convulsing after 6 hours, hallucinating after 12, and begging for death after 24. Some lasted a week before their minds completely shattered, speaking to invisible demons and laughing at nothing. The classification system for torture reveals how methodically the Japanese approached human suffering. They categorized punishments into 5 levels of severity, each with dozens of variations. First-degree torture might involve beating with special bamboo rods split to create maximum welts with minimum risk of death. Second degree added suspension and joint dislocation. Third degree introduced cutting and burning. Fourth degree combined multiple methods simultaneously. Fifth degree was reserved for the worst criminals and involved tortures so extreme that contemporary writers refused to fully document them, stating only that hell itself would be preferable. Each degree had specific duration requirements, tools allowed, and recovery periods between sessions to ensure maximum cumulative suffering. The seasonal adaptation of punishments shows how environment became a weapon. Summer executions utilized Japan's crushing humidity. Victims would be sealed in wooden boxes with small air holes, the heat and moisture creating a slow suffocation while their skin rotted from constant dampness. Winter brought shimobashira, victims stripped naked and repeatedly doused with water in freezing temperatures until they became living ice sculptures, conscious but unable to move as their blood literally froze in their veins. Spring executions might involve being buried alive with bamboo shoots planted above them, the fast-growing plants eventually piercing through their punnies. Autumn brought mushikago, the insect cage where victims were covered in sweet rice wine and tied near wasp nests or ant colonies. The corruption of Buddhist and Shinto religious practices for torture purposes created spiritual as well as physical agony. Monks who committed crimes faced punishments that perverted their own beliefs. They might be forced to write sutras in their own blood while suspended by hooks through their flesh, each character requiring fresh wounds. Sacred bells would be heated and placed on their shaved heads, the bronze conducting heat directly to the skull, while the bell's ring was said to carry their screams to heaven. Some were made to meditate in positions that dislocated joints, maintaining religious posture while experiencing physical destruction. The combination of spiritual violation and bodily torture was designed to destroy both body and soul. The practice of lingqi, though borrowed from China, was refined by the Japanese into something even more terrible. While the Chinese death by 1,000 cuts was brutal, the Japanese version incorporated their aesthetic sensibilities. Cuts were made in patterns that resembled falling cherry blossoms or flowing water. The executioner was judged not just on keeping the victim alive, but on the artistic merit of the cutting pattern. Some executioners became famous for their ability to remove skin in single sheets that could later be preserved and displayed. The victims' suffering became secondary to the visual impact of their destruction, turning human bodies into canvases for sadistic art. The role of women in the punishment system reveals gender-specific cruelties that reflected Japan's patriarchal structure. Female criminals faced tortures designed to attack their perceived feminine virtues. Ishidaki involved kneeling on sharp stones with heavy weights on the thighs, specifically targeting the legs considered essential to feminine grace. Adulteresses might have their hair, a symbol of beauty, pulled out strand by strand over days. The wooden horse torture was modified for women with a sharp ridge that would destroy their ability to bear children. Pregnant criminals faced the horrific choice of immediate execution or waiting until afterbirth, knowing their child would be killed or enslaved. The system ensured that female suffering attacked not just the body, but the social constructs of womanhood itself. The documentation methods for these punishments created an archive of atrocity that served multiple purposes. Official scribes recorded every scream, every plea, every bodily function lost to pain. These records weren't just bureaucratic. They were studied to improve torture methods. Executioners would review past sessions to identify which techniques produced the longest suffering, which victims broke fastest, which family members' reactions caused the most additional anguish to the condemned. The Japanese created a science of suffering, complete with detailed, anatomical drawings showing optimal insertion points for various implements, charts tracking consciousness levels during different tortures, and tables calculating how much blood loss could be sustained while maintaining awareness. The public display aspects transformed individual punishment into social control. Execution grounds were carefully chosen for maximum visibility. Victims would be paraded through specific routes designed to pass by temples they'd dishonoured, homes of people they'd wronged, or schools where children could witness the price of defying authority. The processions included musicians playing discordant tunes said to disturb the victim's spirit, preventing peaceful death. Crowds were expected to participate by throwing refuse, shouting condemnations, or spitting on the condemned. But showing too much enthusiasm could mark you as bloodthirsty, while showing sympathy risked association with the criminal. Citizens had to perform exactly the right level of contempt, turning every execution into a test of social conformity. The integration of torture into the legal system wasn't haphazard, but followed complex juridical principles. Judges didn't simply sentence someone to death. They had to calculate the exact type and duration of suffering based on legal precedent, social status, nature of the crime, time of year, and even astrological considerations. Legal texts from the period read like torture manuals, with detailed descriptions of which punishments applied to which crimes. A theft of rice might merit hand removal by slow crushing, while stealing money required finger removal, joint by joint. The precision gave torture a veneer of justice, as if mathematical calculation of suffering somehow made it righteous. The psychological torture methods developed by feudal Japanese authorities demonstrated an understanding of mental anguish that preceded modern psychological warfare by centuries. Seishin Teki Gumon, spiritual torture, targeted the mind before the body. Samurai might be forced to watch as their ancestral swords were melted down, the destruction of family heirlooms causing agony no physical pain could match. They would be made to compose death poems praising their executioners, the perversion of the honourable Jisei tradition adding layers of humiliation. Some were required to teach their own children the crimes of their bloodline, planting seeds of shame that would grow for generations. The authorities understood that breaking someone's identity could be more devastating than breaking their bones. The refinement of crucifixion in Japan added elements that made Roman practices seem merciful by comparison. Haritsuke wasn't simple nailing to wood. It was a choreographed destruction lasting days. Victims were tied with specific knots that gradually tightened as they struggled, each movement increasing their bondage. Spears would be thrust through the body at calculated angles, missing vital organs but maximizing pain. The positioning allowed crowds to walk completely around the victim, ensuring 360-degree visibility of suffering. But the true innovation was the mercy spear. Relatives could pay for a guard to deliver a killing thrust, but the price was often their entire wealth, forcing families to choose between poverty and watching loved ones die slowly. The winter punishment called korizime weaponized Japan's cold climate, with scientific precision. Victims weren't simply exposed to cold. They were subjected to carefully controlled freezing and thawing cycles. Guards would strip prisoners and douse them with water in freezing temperatures until ice formed on their skin. Then they'd be brought near fires just long enough for the ice to melt, causing excruciating pain as blood returned to frozen extremities. This cycle would repeat for days, with physicians monitoring to prevent actual death while maximising frostbite damage. Survivors often lost all their fingers and toes, marked forever by blackened stumps that proclaimed their crimes to anyone who saw them. The practice of tsurushi-zame, suspension torture, incorporated complex ropework that turned the body against itself. Unlike simple hanging, victims were suspended in positions that caused specific types of agony. The shrimp tie bent the spine backward until victims felt their backs breaking. The heaven and earth position hung people between poles with joints hyperextended. The floating world suspension left victims spinning slowly, inducing severe nausea while blood pooled in whatever body part hung lowest. Rope masters studied for years to learn exactly how to tie knots that would cut off circulation without causing death, creating limbs that screamed with pain as they slowly died while keeping the victim conscious. The corruption of tea ceremony rituals for execution purposes shows how deeply punishment penetrated Japanese culture. Condemned nobles might be forced to perform a final tea ceremony where every element was poisoned with symbolism. The tea would be bitter herbs that caused hallucinations. The ceremonial movements had to be performed with broken fingers or dislocated shoulders. Family members were made to attend and participate, sharing poisoned tea that wouldn't kill but would cause violent illness. The slow, meditative pace of the ceremony, normally a source of peace, became psychological torture, as participants knew each moment brought them closer to death. Some accounts describe ceremonies lasting entire days, with victims maintaining perfect form despite agony. The child punishment protocols reveal systematic cruelty toward the most vulnerable. Children of criminals face scaled-down versions of adult tortures, calculated to cause maximum pain without killing growing bodies that might provide future labour. The small stones punishment forced children to kneel on pebbles sized precisely to cause pain without permanent damage. Butterfly boards were wooden frames that slowly pulled children's limbs apart over days, stopping just short of dislocation. Perhaps most psychologically damaging was mirror punishment. Children were made to watch their parents tortured, while being told they would receive the same treatment when they reached adulthood, creating years of anticipatory terror. The economic structure supporting the punishment system created entire industries devoted to human suffering. Rope makers specialised in torture bonds that wouldn't break under extreme strain. Blacksmiths forged implements designed for maximum pain with minimum lethality. Carpenters built execution devices with the same pride they brought to temple construction. These weren't shadowy figures, but respected craftsmen whose work was displayed publicly. A well-made torture device could become a family heirloom, passed down through generations of executioners. The normalization of torture manufacturing meant that walking through a market, you might see torture implements displayed next to farming tools, their presence so common it ceased to disturb. The medical knowledge gained through systematic torture advanced Japanese understanding of anatomy in morally catastrophic ways. Torturers documented exactly how much pressure would break specific bones, which herbs would keep victims conscious during extreme pain, how to cauterize wounds to prevent death while maximizing suffering. This knowledge was compiled into medical texts that mixed healing wisdom with destruction techniques. Doctors trained in these methods faced impossible ethical positions. Their expertise came from atrocity, but refusing to use it meant letting patients suffer. The corruption of medical knowledge created generations of healers whose skills were forever tainted by their origins. The sexual torture methods employed against both men and women demonstrated calculated attacks on human dignity. Male criminals might have their genitals slowly crushed in wooden presses while being forced to watch their wives violated. Women faced implements designed to destroy their ability to experience pleasure or bear children. The Jade Gate torture used heated metal rods in ways too horrific to fully describe. These weren't just physical punishments but attacks on future generations. Criminals wouldn't just die, but would have their genetic lines severed. The combination of sexual violence with execution created traumas that survivors could never speak about. suffering that remained locked inside broken minds. The record-keeping systems for punishments evolved into a bureaucracy of suffering that would make modern databases seem primitive. Every scream was categorized by volume and pitch. Every confession was transcribed with notation about which torture method extracted it. Executioners maintained genealogical charts tracking criminal bloodlines across generations, ensuring that the grandson of a traitor would face enhanced scrutiny. These archives, stored in specially built buildings, became resources for improving torture techniques. Officials would research which combination of punishments broke specific types of criminals fastest. The transformation of human agony into data points created a cold efficiency that made spontaneous mercy impossible. Everything followed precedent, documented in blood and tears. The theatrical elements incorporated into public executions transformed them into elaborate performances that could last days. Criminals weren't simply killed, but forced to act out morality plays depicting their crimes and punishment. A corrupt merchant might be made to count imaginary money while his fingers were removed one by one. A false priest would recite corrupted sutras while being slowly dismembered in patterns matching religious iconography. Costumes were created specifically for executions. Robes that would dramatically reveal wounds, masks that amplified screams, platforms that displayed victims at optimal viewing angles. The audience was expected to respond at specific moments with prescribed chants or gestures, making them active participants in the choreographed death. The poison cultivation programs developed by feudal authorities created an entire agricultural system devoted to death. Special gardens grew plants used exclusively for torture, herbs that caused burning sensations without damaging tissue, flowers whose pollen induced temporary blindness, roots that paralyzed specific muscle groups. These gardens were tended with the same care as food crops, with detailed almanacs tracking optimal harvest times for maximum potency. Poison masters would blend custom mixtures for specific executions, creating compounds that might cause a criminal to experience the sensation of drowning while on dry land, or feel insects crawling under their skin for days before death. The artistry applied to creating suffering showed how thoroughly cruelty had been integrated into Japanese cultural practices. The architectural innovations in torture chambers and execution grounds reflected sophisticated understanding of psychological intimidation. Rooms were designed with specific acoustics to amplify screams and carry them to holding cells where future victims waited. Floors were slanted to ensure blood flowed in patterns that created maximum visual impact. Windows were positioned to cast shadows that made torture implements appear larger and more menacing. Some chambers featured elaborate pulley systems that allowed a single executioner to simultaneously torture multiple victims, creating symphonies of synchronized suffering. The investment in infrastructure showed that torture wasn't an aberration, but a fundamental government function requiring proper facilities. The development of living death punishments pushed the boundaries between life and termination. Criminals might be sealed inside specially constructed cells with tiny air holes that provided just enough oxygen to prevent suffocation. Food and water would be provided through tubes in amounts calculated to sustain life at the absolute minimum. These victims could survive for months or even years in complete darkness, their muscles atrophying, their minds dissolving, kept technically alive but experiencing none of life's qualities. Some sentences specified exact durations: 3 years of living death followed by execution, creating anticipation of death as the only possible mercy. The family hostage systems ensured compliance through weaponized love. When someone was accused of serious crimes, their entire family would be detained in conditions that depended on the accused's cooperation. If a criminal confessed quickly, their children might merely face comfortable imprisonment. Resistance meant family members would be tortured in view of the accused, their suffering calibrated to break resistance. The most sadistic variation was incremental punishment. Each day of denial meant a specific torture applied to a specific relative. Day 1 might be needles under a daughter's fingernails. Day 2, a son's fingers broken. The systematic destruction of loved ones created a arithmetic of anguish where criminals could calculate exactly how much their resistance cost in family suffering. The integration of fortune-telling and astrology into execution timing added cosmic dimensions to punishment. Deaths weren't scheduled randomly, but according to complex calculations involving birth dates, crime dates, and celestial positions. An execution performed under the wrong stars was believed to release the criminal's spirit for revenge. This created scenarios where victims might wait months for astronomically appropriate death dates, their anticipation building as they tracked the same stars that sealed their fate. Some particularly heinous criminals were executed during eclipses, their deaths timed to the moment of greatest darkness. The merger of superstition with state violence gave executions religious weight that made resistance seem like defying heaven itself. The pharmaceutical experimentation on condemned prisoners advanced Japanese medicine through unconscionable means. Prisoners became test subjects for new poisons, antidotes, and pain management techniques. Doctors would systematically poison victims, document symptoms, attempt cures, and repeat the cycle. Some experiments tested how long humans could survive with specific organs damaged or removed. Others explored pain thresholds across different demographic groups. The knowledge gained was meticulously recorded in medical texts that mixed legitimate healing practices with data obtained through torture. This created an ethical contamination of Japanese medicine that persisted for centuries, healing knowledge forever tainted by its acquisition through deliberate harm. The development of portable torture devices allowed punishment to follow criminals beyond fixed locations. Travelling magistrates carried collections of implements that could transform any space into a torture chamber. These portable kits were marvels of engineering, devices that folded into innocuous-looking boxes but could be assembled into elaborate pain delivery systems. Some were designed for specific punishments: finger crushers that looked like writing boxes, neck clamps disguised as travelling pillows, needle sets that appeared to be sewing kits. The portability meant that justice, or rather injustice, could be dispensed anywhere, removing any sense of sanctuary or safe space within Japanese territory. The artistic documentation of executions created a disturbing genre that blended high culture with human suffering. Master painters were commissioned to capture famous executions in silk scrolls that would be preserved in noble houses. These weren't crude depictions, but elaborate artworks showing every detail: the way blood splattered in specific patterns, the exact expression on a victim's face at the moment of death, the positioning of crowds and executioners. Some artists specialized in painting the sequential stages of prolonged executions, creating scroll series that could be unrolled to reveal the progression from living person to mangled corpse. The commodification of death into art objects meant that wealthy collectors might own galleries of human suffering, displaying torture scenes with the same pride as landscape paintings. The sound engineering of execution grounds reveals an obsession with auditory suffering that paralleled visual spectacle. Architects designed spaces with specific acoustic properties, walls that reflected screams back at victims, creating echo chambers of their own agony. Musicians composed execution soundtracks using instruments designed to accompany different types of death. The shamisen played different melodies for beheading versus burning. Taiko drums matched their rhythm to a victim's heartbeat, speeding up as death approached. Some executions featured silence torture, where victims were forbidden from screaming, with their tongues removed if they violated the rule, forcing them to suffer in mute agony while orchestras played around them. The breeding programs for executioner families created hereditary lines devoted to perfecting death. These families intermarried to preserve and refine their techniques, creating bloodlines where children learned anatomy by practicing on condemned criminals. Sons would assist fathers from young ages, starting with simple tasks like rope preparation and advancing to active participation. Daughters learned the specific techniques used for female prisoners. These families developed physical traits suited to their profession: strong arms for wielding heavy blades, steady hands for precise cuts, emotional detachment that let them eat dinner after spending all day dismembering humans. The normalization of execution as family trade created generations where torture was as mundane as farming. The seasonal festival integrations transformed executions into calendar events that communities planned around. Spring executions coincided with planting festivals, the blood of criminals said to fertilize fields. Summer deaths occurred during Obon, when spirits of ancestors returned. Criminals executed then were believed to be immediately dragged to hell by waiting demons. Autumn executions matched harvest celebrations, with specific tortures themed around agricultural implements. Winter deaths aligned with New Year preparations, clearing out the old year's evil. These weren't somber occasions, but community gatherings where execution viewing mixed with shopping, eating, and socializing, normalizing death as entertainment. The technological innovations specific to female punishment reflected misogynistic creativity in designing gender-specific suffering. The chrysanthemum board was a device that slowly pulled women's bodies into positions that destroyed their ability to bear children while keeping them conscious to experience their wombs being crushed. The moon bridge arched the spine backward while applying pressure to reproductive organs. The silkworm involved inserting live insects into body cavities, the sensation of internal movement driving victims insane before infection killed them. These devices were decorated with feminine motifs, flowers, butterflies, moon symbols, as if beautifying the instruments somehow elevated the torture beyond mere brutality. The corruption of childhood education through execution attendance created generations traumatized into compliance. Children were required to attend specific executions as part of their moral education. Teachers would quiz students afterward about what crimes led to which punishments, making execution details part of standard curriculum. Children who showed squeamishness were punished for weakness. Those who showed too much enthusiasm were marked as potentially dangerous. The goal was creating citizens who accepted extreme punishment as normal while feeling appropriately subdued by state power. Some children were made to participate in minor ways, holding ropes, carrying water for cleanup, counting lashes, implicating them in the system from young ages. The economic calculations behind different execution methods created a marketplace of death where efficiency competed with spectacle. Simple beheading was cheap but boring. Elaborate tortures drew crowds but required expensive specialists and equipment. Officials developed pricing models that calculated revenue from attendance, vendor sales, and bribes from families seeking quicker deaths against the costs of executioners, equipment maintenance, and cleanup. Some regions specialized in specific execution types based on local expertise. Coastal areas perfected drowning variations. Mountain regions developed exposure techniques. Urban centers focused on elaborate mechanical devices. This economic specialization created execution tourism, where people traveled to witness specific regional punishment styles. The diplomatic uses of punishment as international communication created a language of atrocity between rival domains. When tensions rose between territories, leaders might execute prisoners using methods specifically chosen to send messages. A spy might be killed using techniques from their home region, showing knowledge of enemy practices. Hostages might be tortured in ways that mirrored what their lords had done to others. Some executions were deliberately scheduled to coincide with enemy festivals or celebrations. Bodies or body parts might be sent back, arranged in insulting configurations. This transformation of human suffering into political messaging created cycles of retaliatory atrocity where each side tried to outdo the other in creative cruelty. The philosophical justifications developed by Buddhist and Confucian scholars to reconcile their teachings with systematic torture created intellectual frameworks for atrocity. Texts argued that extreme punishment helped criminals burn off negative karma faster, reaching better rebirths sooner. Confucian scholars claimed that spectacular executions maintained social harmony by demonstrating consequences of disrupting order. Some philosophers developed elaborate metaphysical systems where physical pain was reimagined as spiritual purification. These weren't fringe ideas, but mainstream intellectual positions taught in temples and schools. The corruption of philosophical thought to justify torture created moral confusion that persisted through generations of Japanese thinkers. The medical experimentation conducted under the guise of punishment advanced Japanese anatomical knowledge through methods that would horrify modern medical ethics boards. Condemned prisoners became involuntary subjects for studying how long humans could survive, with various organs removed or damaged. Doctors would carefully extract organs while keeping victims alive, documenting which were essential for immediate survival versus slow decline. They mapped nerve clusters by applying pressure and recording pain responses. They tested blood loss limits by making precise cuts and timing unconsciousness. This knowledge, recorded in medical texts with detailed anatomical drawings, created a foundation of healing built on systematic harm. Future doctors learned life-saving techniques from records of deliberate killing, forever contaminating Japanese medicine with its origins in torture chambers. The psychological conditioning of executioners reveals how normal people were transformed into willing instruments of atrocity. Young men entering the profession underwent systematic desensitization, first watching executions, then handling corpses, then performing minor tasks, gradually increasing involvement until taking lives became routine. They were taught to see victims not as humans, but as objects requiring technical manipulation. Emotional responses were beaten out of them through punishment for showing mercy or disgust. Many developed dissociative personalities, kind family men who became emotionless machines when wearing executioner robes. Retirement often brought mental collapse as suppressed humanity reasserted itself, with many elderly executioners going mad from accumulated guilt or committing suicide using the same methods they'd inflicted on others. The expansion of punishment into occupied territories exported Japanese cruelty across Asia. As feudal lords conquered new domains, they brought their torture techniques as tools of control. Local populations faced punishments designed not just to kill, but to demonstrate Japanese superiority through superior suffering. Indigenous execution methods were declared primitive and replaced with civilized Japanese techniques, requiring specialized equipment and training. This created hierarchies of death where Japanese criminals might receive quicker executions than foreign rebels who faced the full creativity of imported torture. The spread of Japanese punishment methods left scars across Asia, with some techniques surviving in local practices long after Japanese withdrawal. The sex-specific tortures developed for different social classes reveal how punishment reinforced existing hierarchies. Samurai women faced tortures that attacked their aristocratic dignity, hair torn out strand by strand, faces disfigured to destroy beauty, bodies exposed in ways that violated modesty codes. Merchant women endured punishments related to commerce, hands crushed for theft, tongues removed for lying about goods. Peasant women faced agricultural-themed tortures, buried in fields like seeds, crushed under millstones, tied to ploughs and forced to pull like oxen. Geisha and courtesans faced sexualized punishments that perverted their professional skills. Each torture was precisely calibrated to attack what that class of woman valued most, showing deep psychological understanding of different female experiences. The invention of generational punishments created suffering that literally lasted centuries. Some crimes resulted in curses upon bloodlines. Every descendant would face specific limitations or punishments for set numbers of generations. A traitor's family might be forbidden from owning land for 7 generations. Children born with certain birthmarks were considered marked by ancestral crimes and faced automatic suspicion. Family registries tracked these generational sentences, creating hereditary criminal classes who inherited guilt they didn't earn. Some families maintained detailed records of ancestors' crimes and remaining punishment generations, planning marriages and careers around these inherited sentences. The concept that crime could contaminate blood across centuries created unique psychological burdens where people suffered for acts committed before their birth. The riot control methods developed to manage execution crowds became models for population control that influenced modern crowd management. Authorities learned that execution crowds could turn volatile. Too much suffering might spark sympathy riots, while insufficient spectacle caused disappointed mobs. They developed techniques for managing crowd emotions through careful pacing of events, strategic placement of vendors to create comfort zones, and use of plants in crowds to model appropriate responses. Guards were trained to read crowd mood and adjust execution parameters accordingly, speeding up if sympathy built, adding flourishes if attention waned. This manipulation of mass psychology through staged atrocity provided lessons in social control that extended far beyond execution grounds. The international observers who documented Japanese punishment methods created a complex legacy of horror tourism and cultural exchange. Portuguese missionaries, Dutch traders, and Chinese diplomats all recorded witnessing executions, their accounts mixing fascination with revulsion. Some observers took detailed notes that they brought back to their own countries, spreading Japanese techniques globally. Others used witnessed atrocities as justification for considering Japanese as barbarians needing civilizing. But most disturbing were those who became connoisseurs of comparative cruelty, travelling between countries to witness different execution styles and debating which nation perfected suffering best. This dark cultural exchange spread not just techniques, but the mindset that turned human agony into spectacle worth travelling to see. The underground resistance movements that developed in response to extreme punishments created shadow networks of mercy within systems of cruelty. Secret societies formed to provide poison to condemned prisoners, allowing quicker death than official sentences. Bribed guards might ensure vital organs were pierced during supposedly non-fatal torture. Executioners' assistants learned to subtly increase bleeding or adjust positions to hasten death. Families developed codes for requesting these mercies, passing information through seemingly innocent prayers or offerings. But discovery meant facing the same tortures they sought to prevent, creating heroes who risked everything to slightly reduce others' suffering. These networks showed that even within systems of absolute cruelty, human compassion found ways to manifest, though often in heartbreaking forms. The collapse of the feudal punishment system during the Meiji Restoration revealed the deep psychological scars carved into Japanese society by centuries of normalized atrocity. When the new government banned traditional torture methods in 1873, many officials genuinely didn't understand how to maintain order without spectacular cruelty. Local magistrates petitioned for exceptions, arguing that their regions were uniquely criminal and required special measures. Executioners found themselves unemployed, with skills useless in modernizing Japan. Men who knew 100 ways to kill slowly but couldn't perform any peaceful trade. Some committed suicide using the very methods they'd inflicted on others, their final acts completing circles of violence. Others became butchers or surgeons, applying their anatomical knowledge to legal professions while carrying memories of when they used those same skills for torture. The preservation efforts for torture devices during modernization created disturbing museums of suffering that authorities couldn't decide whether to destroy or display. Some regions buried their execution equipment in shame, creating archaeological sites where future excavations would uncover humanity's creative cruelty. Others preserved devices as historical artifacts, cleaning blood from mechanisms that had destroyed thousands. The most elaborate torture chambers were converted to other uses: storage rooms, small shrines, even classrooms where children learned in spaces that had echoed with screams. But workers reported strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, and feelings of overwhelming dread in these repurposed spaces, as if suffering had soaked so deeply into the architecture that it couldn't be exorcised by mere renovation. The victims' descendants carried inherited trauma that manifested in ways psychology was only beginning to understand. Families of executed criminals faced generations of discrimination, changing names and moving regions to escape ancestral shame. But the psychological damage went deeper. Children and grandchildren of torture victims showed higher rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide even when they hadn't directly experienced persecution. Some families developed elaborate rituals to appease ancestors who died in agony, believing restless spirits caused their continued misfortune. Others embraced their dark heritage, keeping detailed records of ancestral sufferings as warnings about state power. The concept of inherited trauma wasn't scientifically recognized yet, but these families lived its reality through generations of unexplained pain. The Western documentation of Japanese punishment methods created international controversies that influenced Japan's modernization efforts. When Commodore Perry's expedition witnessed executions, their horrified reports became ammunition for those claiming Japan needed Western civilization. Photographers who captured execution images created visual records that Japan later desperately tried to suppress, buying up negatives and prints to destroy evidence of practices they now considered shameful. But these images had already spread globally, cementing Western perceptions of Japanese barbarity that would influence international relations for decades. The irony that Western nations had their own histories of creative cruelty was lost in the rush to position Japan as uniquely savage. The influence of feudal punishment aesthetics on Japanese art and culture created disturbing undercurrents that persisted into modernity. Ukiyo-e prints depicting famous executions became collectible art, their beautiful composition at odds with horrific content. Kabuki theatre incorporated stylized torture scenes that transformed real suffering into entertainment. Ghost stories centered on vengeful spirits of torture victims became a literary genre, keeping memories of atrocity alive through supernatural fiction. Even modern manga and anime occasionally reference historical punishment methods, sanitizing them into dramatic devices divorced from their horrific reality. This aesthetic transformation of torture into art allowed Japanese culture to simultaneously acknowledge and distance itself from its cruel past. The scientific analysis of preserved torture devices by modern researchers reveals engineering sophistication that challenges assumptions about pre-industrial technology. Devices show understanding of leverage, pressure points, and material stress that rival modern engineering. Some implements used principles that wouldn't be formally described by physics for centuries after their invention. The metallurgy of blades designed for specific types of cuts shows advanced knowledge of steel properties. Springs and tensions in stretching devices demonstrate mathematical precision in calculating human breaking points. This technical excellence applied to human destruction shows how advanced societies can direct innovation toward cruelty as easily as creation. The economic impact of abandoning the punishment system created unexpected social disruptions that revealed how deeply torture had been integrated into feudal society. Entire towns that had economically depended on hosting executions faced collapse when the crowd stopped coming. Craftsmen who specialized in torture implements had to find new trades or starve. The herbs and plants cultivated specifically for torture suddenly had no market, leaving poisonous gardens to grow wild. Merchants who sold food and souvenirs at execution grounds lost their livelihoods. The revelation that so many people's legitimate work depended on human suffering showed how thoroughly cruelty had been woven into the economic fabric of feudal Japan. The attempt to document and categorize historical punishments for academic purposes created ethical dilemmas that continue today. Scholars studying feudal torture methods must balance historical accuracy with avoiding gratuitous detail that might inspire modern sadists. Museums face questions about how to display torture devices, as warnings about human cruelty or as fascinating artifacts that risk glorifying suffering. Textbooks must decide how much detail serves education versus traumatization. Some information remains deliberately suppressed. Specific poison formulas, construction plans for certain devices, techniques considered too dangerous to preserve even academically. This selective historical amnesia shows ongoing recognition that some knowledge is too dangerous to maintain, even as historical record. The comparison between Japanese feudal punishments and contemporary systems worldwide reveals universal patterns in how societies justify cruelty through claims of justice, order, and spiritual necessity. Every culture that developed elaborate torture systems also developed elaborate justifications, philosophical, religious, and practical arguments for why extreme suffering served greater goods. The Japanese focus on maintaining social harmony through spectacular punishment parallels other societies' use of public execution for deterrence. The involvement of religious authorities in sanctifying state violence appears across cultures and centuries. These patterns suggest that the capacity for systematized cruelty isn't culturally specific, but emerges whenever absolute power combines with ideological certainty about who deserves to suffer. The legacy of feudal Japan's punishment system continues to haunt modern Japanese society in ways both subtle and profound. Contemporary Japanese crime rates remain among the world's lowest, leading some scholars to argue that centuries of spectacular punishment created a culture of compliance that persists through generations. But this orderliness comes with costs. Psychological studies show Japanese society maintains higher rates of conformity anxiety, fear of authority, and self-censorship compared to cultures without such extreme historical punishment systems. The ghosts of the execution grounds live on in the excessive apologizing, the terror of standing out, the group harmony prioritized over individual expression. What was beaten into the population through centuries of public torture evolved into internalized self-policing that no longer needs external enforcement. The modern Japanese legal system's treatment of confessions reveals disturbing continuities with feudal torture practices. While physical torture is banned, psychological pressure to confess remains intense, with conviction rates over 99% largely based on confessions. Suspects face interrogations lasting weeks, isolated from family and lawyers, pressed to admit guilt in ways that echo feudal demands for public acknowledgement of crimes. The belief that confession purifies the criminal soul, allowing reintegration into society, stems directly from feudal concepts, where admitting guilt under torture was seen as spiritual cleansing. Modern Japan replaced physical agony with psychological pressure, but the fundamental belief that justice requires the criminal's participation in their own condemnation remains unchanged from when that participation was extracted through systematic torture. The international war crimes committed by Japan during World War II showed how quickly a society could resurrect dormant cruelty when political conditions allowed. The torture techniques used in Unit 731's medical experiments, the creative punishments inflicted on prisoners of war, the systematic brutality in occupied territories, all demonstrated that the knowledge and mindset of feudal torture had never truly disappeared, merely gone underground. Military personnel who had never witnessed feudal executions somehow knew how to inflict maximum suffering using methods their ancestors had perfected. The speed with which ordinary soldiers became capable of extraordinary cruelty suggested that cultural memory of systematized torture runs deeper than conscious awareness. The ongoing discoveries of execution grounds and torture chambers during construction projects forces modern Japan to literally confront the bones of its cruel past. Workers building shopping centers uncover mass graves of execution victims. Subway excavations reveal underground torture chambers with devices still in place. These discoveries create complex legal and ethical dilemmas. Are these crime scenes requiring investigation, archaeological sites needing preservation, or shameful remnants requiring quiet disposal? Each unearthed skeleton represents someone who died in calculated agony, but their names and crimes are lost, leaving only evidence of suffering. Some sites become small shrines where locals leave offerings for unnamed spirits. Acknowledging horror, they prefer not to examine too closely. The influence on global torture practices through cultural exchange remains one of feudal Japan's darkest exports. Portuguese traders brought descriptions of Japanese methods back to European inquisitors. Chinese torturers incorporated Japanese innovations into their own practices. Korean occupiers learned techniques they would later suffer under during Japanese colonization. The cross-pollination of cruelty created international networks of suffering where effective torture methods spread like technological innovations. Modern human rights investigators still encounter techniques traceable to feudal Japanese origins in torture chambers worldwide, showing how creative cruelty becomes immortal through imitation. The psychological profile of modern Japan, viewed through the lens of historical trauma, reveals a society shaped by centuries of spectacular punishment, even generations after its end. The emphasis on group harmony over individual expression, the acceptance of hierarchical authority, the preference for indirect communication that avoids confrontation, all can be traced to survival strategies developed under systems where standing out meant death and questioning authority meant torture. The famous Japanese concepts of hone and tatamai, true feelings versus public facade, evolved in societies where revealing true thoughts could lead to execution grounds. What tourists admire as Japanese politeness and order grows from soil fertilized with blood and terror. The attempts to study feudal punishment systems using modern psychological and sociological frameworks reveal complexities that challenge simple condemnation. Researchers find that societies with extreme punishment systems often developed equally extreme forms of art, philosophy, and human bonding. The same culture that perfected torture also created tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and poetry of stunning beauty. Some scholars argue that experiencing humanity's darkest capabilities drove compensatory creation of transcendent beauty. Others suggest that aesthetic refinement and refined cruelty spring from the same source, a culture that pursued every human experience to its absolute limit, whether sublime or horrific. The modern Japanese horror genre's global success connects directly to cultural memories of feudal punishment. Films like Audition and Ichi the Killer, that seem shockingly extreme to Western audiences, tap into deep cultural knowledge of how bodies can be destroyed and minds can be broken. The technical precision of suffering depicted in Japanese horror, where every cut has meaning and pain follows careful choreography, echoes the methodical nature of feudal torture. These aren't simply scary movies, but cultural exorcisms, allowing modern Japanese to safely experience echoes of historical trauma their ancestors endured in deadly reality. As we conclude this journey through one of history's most systematically cruel punishment systems, we must ask what lessons it offers modern society. The feudal Japanese example warns how quickly normalized violence becomes tradition, how elaborate justifications can make any atrocity seem reasonable, how human creativity applied to causing suffering can reach heights or depths that challenge comprehension. It shows that advanced civilizations aren't immune to barbarism, but might perfect it through the same innovation that creates art and beauty. Most disturbingly, it demonstrates that ordinary people can become willing participants in extraordinary evil when society validates cruelty as justice. The empty execution grounds now covered by office buildings and shopping centres remind us that progress doesn't erase history, it merely builds atop it. Every society contains within itself the capacity for systematised cruelty that feudal Japan perfected. The difference between a culture that creates tea ceremonies and one that creates torture chambers might be smaller than we comfort ourselves believing. In our modern world where state violence still exists, but hides behind euphemisms and closed doors, the honest brutality of feudal punishment serves as a warning. The human capacity for justified atrocity remains constant across cultures and centuries. Only vigilant acknowledgement of our darkest capabilities offers hope of transcending them. The victims of feudal Japan's torture chambers died in agony, but their suffering need not be meaningless if it reminds us that civilization is always only one decision away from savagery, and that decision must be made anew by every generation that inherits the terrible knowledge of what humans can do to each other in the name of order, justice, and peace.